He thought calling her out would be entertaining, but he had no idea he was about to dismantle his own reputation in front of an entire lecture hall. The auditorium at Westbridge University shimmered under bright overhead lights, rows of polished wooden seats filled with graduate students, visiting faculty, and donors dressed in tailored suits, all waiting for Professor Richard Hale to begin his highly anticipated calculus symposium. Known for his razor-sharp intellect and even sharper arrogance, Hale thrived on control, on being the smartest person in every room, and today was no different. His voice carried easily across the hall as he introduced a complex theorem stretching across the whiteboard 6 feet wide, filled with dense symbols and layered logic. Most in the audience followed carefully, others simply nodded, pretending to understand. In the back row, barely noticeable, sat Evelyn Brooks, her gray cardigan slightly worn, her posture quiet, her pen moving steadily across a notebook. No one paid her any attention, and that was exactly how it had been for weeks. Whispers had followed her since she first appeared. Some thought she was cleaning staff, others assumed she was auditing the class for personal interest. Either way, she didn't belong, not here, not among elite academics who debated theories over catered lunches and international conferences. As Hale continued his explanation, his tone grew more animated, his confidence swelling with every passing minute. Then it happened, a brief pause as he invited questions. The room hesitated, as it always did, until unexpectedly a soft voice broke the silence. Evelyn's hand had risen almost involuntarily, her question precise, almost surgical, pointing to a subtle inconsistency in his fourth step. The room shifted slightly, a few eyebrows raised. Hale turned slowly, his expression tightening, not with curiosity, but irritation. Your name? He asked, his voice controlled but edged. Evelyn Brooks, she replied quietly. And your department? He pressed, already sensing the answer. Facilities support, she said. A ripple of quiet laughter spread across the room. Hale's lips curled into a faint smile. Facilities support, he repeated, letting the words linger as if tasting them. How interesting. He stepped closer, resting one hand against the board. And you believe you've identified a flaw in my proof? Evelyn immediately shook her head slightly. Not a flaw, just a potential inconsistency, depending on boundary conditions. But Hale cut her off, raising a hand dismissively. Perhaps instead of speculating on advanced mathematics, you should focus on more accessible responsibilities. The laughter grew louder now, more confident. Emboldened by his approval, Evelyn felt the heat rise in her cheeks, but she said nothing. She lowered her gaze as if retreating back into the safety of invisibility. Hale, however, was not finished. Something about the moment had triggered him. Perhaps it was the precision of her words or the quiet certainty behind them. Either way, he saw an opportunity to reassert dominance, to remind the room who held authority. Then let's make this educational for everyone, he said, suddenly stepping aside and gesturing toward the board. Why don't you come up here and show us exactly what you mean? The invitation hung in the air, heavy, unmistakable, not an offer, but a challenge, a performance designed for humiliation. A few students exchanged glances, others leaned forward, anticipation building like a slow tightening wire. Evelyn hesitated just long enough for the room to notice. Then she stood, the faint sound of her shoes echoing against the marble floor as she walked toward the front. Every step, watched every movement, judged, and in that moment no one in that room, including Professor Hale, realized they were about to witness something that would redefine everything they thought they understood about brilliance. The moment Evelyn Brooks reached the front of the lecture hall, the energy in the room shifted from casual amusement to sharpened attention. Her fingers brushed lightly against the chalk tray, as if reacquainting themselves with something long familiar. Behind her, she could feel the weight of 100 eyes, some curious, some dismissive, some already certain of what would happen next. Professor Richard Hale stepped aside with a measured smile, his arms crossed tightly across his chest, the posture of a man who believed he had already won. Take your time, he said, his voice echoing just enough to carry through the room. We would not want to rush excellence. A few scattered chuckles followed. Evelyn nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and turned toward the board. The equation stretched before her, dense and layered symbols woven into a structure designed to intimidate even seasoned mathematicians. For a brief second her hand hovered midair, the chalk just inches from the surface, and in that pause the room leaned in closer. Someone whispered under their breath, "This is going to be uncomfortable." Another voice added, "She will not even know where to begin." But then Evelyn exhaled slowly and placed the chalk against the board. The first line she wrote was simple, almost understated, a reframe of the original expression, subtle but intentional. The scratching sound echoed clearly in the silence behind her. Hale's expression remained confident, though his eyes narrowed slightly as he tracked her movements line by line. She continued, not hesitating, not second-guessing each transformation, precise, each step building seamlessly into the next. What began as a quiet murmur among the students slowly faded as the rhythm of her work took over. There was something different about the way she approached the problem, not just competence, but clarity, like someone navigating familiar terrain rather than solving something new. 2 minutes passed, then 3. The room grew noticeably still. Even the faint hum of the overhead lights seemed louder against the absence of conversation. Hale shifted his stance, uncrossing his arms as he stepped closer, his gaze fixed on the board, searching for a mistake, an inconsistency, anything that would restore the balance he had so carefully constructed. But there was nothing. Her solution unfolded cleanly, elegant in its efficiency. She reached the midpoint of the proof, and without pausing adjusted a substitution that simplified an entire section. Several students exchanged quick glances. One of them leaned forward, gripping the edge of his notebook as if trying to keep up. This is not standard, he whispered almost to himself. Evelyn did not look back. She did not acknowledge the growing tension. She simply continued until finally the last line appeared, a concise conclusion that resolved the equation completely. She lowered the chalk gently, placing it back onto the tray. The soft click echoed like a final note in a performance no one had expected. For a moment, no one moved. Hale stepped forward slowly, his eyes scanning the board from top to bottom, his lips parting slightly as he traced each step again and again, searching not just for error, but for explanation. How had she done it? How had someone he dismissed as irrelevant just dismantled a problem he had presented as nearly insurmountable? The silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. Then Evelyn moved again, not stepping away, but stepping closer, her hand reaching for the chalk. Once more she added a single line, just beneath his original formulation, a correction, small, almost invisible to the untrained eye, but devastating in its implication. She stepped back, this time her gaze meeting his directly, calm, steady, unshaken. And in that instant something shifted completely, not just in him, but in the entire room, because what they were beginning to realize was that this was not a moment of luck or coincidence. This was something else entirely, something far beyond what any of them had anticipated. For a few seconds, Professor Richard Hale said nothing. His eyes remained locked on the board, tracing the final line Evelyn had written again and again, as if repetition might somehow change what he was seeing. The confidence that had once defined his posture now seemed to falter, replaced by something far less certain. Confusion edged with disbelief. The room held its breath, waiting for him to respond, but the authority he had worn so comfortably only minutes ago no longer fit the same way. A student in the second row shifted in his seat, glancing at the others, as if silently asking, "Is this real?" Another leaned forward, squinting at the correction Evelyn had added. Her single line had not just adjusted the equation, it had exposed a foundational oversight subtle enough to go unnoticed by most, but significant enough to undermine the entire structure of his proof. Hale finally cleared his throat, a small sound that carried more weight than any lecture he had delivered today. He reached for a marker but stopped mid-motion, his hand hovering just inches from the board, as if unsure whether to challenge or retreat. "You made an interesting adjustment," he said carefully, his voice no longer carrying the same sharp edge. Evelyn did not respond immediately. She simply stood there, composed, her hands relaxed at her sides, her gaze steady, not defiant, not submissive, just present, the kind of presence that did not need to announce itself. A visiting professor seated near the front slowly rose from his chair, the movement subtle but impossible to ignore. His name was Dr. Leonard Hayes, a respected figure whose opinion carried quiet influence across the academic community. He stepped closer, his eyes moving across the board with increasing focus, then toward Evelyn, his expression shifting from curiosity to recognition. "That is not just an adjustment," he said softly, but clearly enough for the entire hall to hear. "That is a structural correction, the kind you only see from someone who has worked with this model extensively." A ripple of unease moved through the audience. Hale straightened instinctively, attempting to regain control of the moment. But Dr. Hayes was not finished. He turned fully toward Evelyn, studying her face more closely, his brows furrowed, as if piecing together a memory. Then suddenly his posture changed completely. "You are Evelyn Brooks," he said, not as a question, but as a realization. The name seemed to echo differently in the room. Heavier, more deliberate, a few faculty members exchanged looks. One of them whispered something quickly under his breath. Hale's expression tightened. "Who exactly do you think she is?" he asked, attempting to inject authority back into his tone. But the effort felt strained. Dr. Hayes did not look away from Evelyn. "She is the one who led the advanced theoretical workshops in Boston 3 years ago," he said. "The one half the faculty here studied under before publishing their recent papers." The silence that followed was absolute. Someone in the back dropped a notebook, the sound sharp against the stillness. Hale's face lost color almost imperceptibly, but enough to notice his eyes flickered between Evelyn and the board, as if trying to reconcile two realities that refused to align. Evelyn finally spoke, her voice calm. "Even I was invited to observe this session," she said simply, "but I did not expect to participate." Her words were not accusatory. They did not need to be. The weight of what had already happened spoke louder than anything she could have added. Dr. Hayes gave a slight nod, his expression now carrying a quiet respect that contrasted sharply with the earlier dismissive laughter in the room. Hale opened his mouth as if to respond, but no words came in. For the first time since the lecture began, the man who had built his identity on certainty stood in complete silence while the truth settled across the room. Like a slow, unrelenting tide, the silence did not break. It deepened, stretching across the lecture hall, like something alive pressing against every person in the room. Professor Richard Hale stood motionless, his eyes no longer scanning the board, but fixed somewhere just beyond it, as if searching for ground that was no longer there. The weight of recognition had shifted everything, not just how Evelyn Brooks was seen, but how he was now being seen. The same students who had laughed minutes ago now avoided his gaze. Their posture changed, their confidence quieted, replaced by an unspoken awareness that they had witnessed something irreversible. Dr. Leonard Hayes stepped back, slightly giving space, but not removing the truth. He had just revealed a truth that hung in the air, heavier than any equation on the board. One of the graduate students slowly raised his hand, not out of curiosity, but uncertainty. "Professor Hale," he began hesitantly, "is the original proof still valid?" The question was simple, but it landed with precision, because now it was no longer theoretical, it was personal. Hale blinked once, then again, as if the words needed time to reach him. He turned back to the board, his own writing now unfamiliar, his earlier certainty reduced to something fragile. Under scrutiny, he cleared his throat, attempting to reassemble authority piece by piece. "The framework remains sound," he said carefully, though his voice lacked its previous sharpness. "However, the refinement Dr. Brooks introduced does improve the structural integrity of the solution." The use of her title did not go unnoticed. It moved through the room like a quiet acknowledgement of correction, of hierarchy, of truth. Evelyn did not react. She did not step forward to claim anything. She simply stood there, her presence steady, grounded, the kind of composure that does not demand recognition, because it does not depend on it. Dr. Hayes nodded once in approval, not exaggerated, not performative, just enough to signal understanding. Another faculty member leaned toward his colleague, whispering quietly, "That explains the methodology." "I thought it looked familiar." The realization spread in fragments, connecting past lectures, published work, and forgotten acknowledgments into a single undeniable point of clarity. Hale stepped away from the board this time, not as a gesture of control, but retreat. He adjusted his sleeves slowly, buying time, but the room no longer waited for him. It had already moved beyond him. Attention shifted naturally toward Evelyn, not with spectacle, but with something quieter, respect, mixed with a touch of disbelief, as if the narrative they had constructed only minutes ago had been quietly dismantled without resistance. Evelyn finally moved, stepping slightly to the side, giving space back to the front of the room. Her voice, when it came, was soft, but carried effortlessly. "Sometimes the smallest assumptions create the largest errors," she said, not as a correction, but as a reflection. The words settled deeper than any critique could have, because they did not accuse, they revealed. Hale looked at her, then really looked this time, not at her clothing, not at her position, but at the presence he had failed to recognize earlier. Something in his expression changed, not dramatically, not enough for everyone to notice, but enough to matter. The edges of certainty softened, replaced by something closer to awareness. He nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. The lecture hall remained still, no applause, no sudden movement, just a shared understanding that something fundamental had shifted. And in that stillness, the polished floors, the bright lights, the rows of observers, all seemed to hold a single quiet truth, that brilliance does not announce itself, and the moment you underestimate it, you have already begun to lose. No one spoke for several seconds after Evelyn Brooks finished her sentence, the kind of silence that did not feel empty, but full, as if every person in the room was quietly recalibrating what they had just witnessed. Professor Richard Hale stood near the edge of the board, no longer occupying the center of attention, his presence still visible, but no longer commanding the space in the same way. The dynamic had shifted subtly but completely, and everyone could feel it. One of the visiting donors seated along the right aisle leaned forward, folding his hands together, his eyes fixed not on Hale, but on Evelyn, as if reassessing the entire purpose of the lecture. Another student flipped back through his notes rapidly, comparing her steps to the original explanation, his brow tightening with each page as realization settled deeper. This was not just a correction, it was a demonstration of mastery delivered without effort, without announcement. Dr. Leonard Hayes broke the silence. First, his voice measured, but carrying unmistakable respect. "Dr. Brooks," he said, turning slightly toward her, "would you be willing to elaborate on the substitution you introduced in the second sequence?" There was no challenge in his tone, only genuine inquiry, the kind reserved for equals, or those regarded even higher. A few heads turned quickly toward Evelyn, anticipating her response. The same woman who had been dismissed moments earlier was now being invited to expand on a solution in front of some of the most respected minds in the room. Evelyn paused for a brief moment, not out of hesitation, but consideration, as if deciding whether the moment required more words. Then she nodded once and stepped forward again, her movements calm, deliberate. She picked up the chalk and with minimal gestures outlined the reasoning behind her approach. Her explanation was concise, but layered, each sentence connecting directly to the next without unnecessary complexity. The audience followed closely, this time not with passive agreement, but with focused attention, the earlier laughter replaced by something closer to quiet admiration. Hale remained still, listening, his expression no longer defensive, but introspective, as if each word she spoke was revealing more than just mathematical logic. It revealed the gap between perception and reality. When Evelyn finished, she placed the chalk down, once more stepping back into stillness. The response was not immediate applause, nor was it loud. Instead, it came in subtle shifts, a slow nod from Dr. Hayes, a quiet exchange of glances among faculty, a student whispering that was incredible under his breath. The recognition was undeniable even without sound. Hale finally spoke, his voice steady but softer than before. "Your approach is efficient," he said, choosing each word carefully. "It offers clarity that I did not initially consider." The admission was not dramatic, but it carried weight, because it came from a man who rarely conceded anything. Evelyn met his gaze briefly, then inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the statement, without elevating it, without diminishing it, simply accepting it for what it was. The lecture could have ended there. Most would have allowed the moment to settle and moved on, but something in the room suggested otherwise, something unfinished, not in the mathematics, but in the understanding. Hale looked back at the board, then at Evelyn again, a different kind of question forming, one not about equations, but about something deeper, something he had not yet fully grasped. And as the room remained suspended in that quiet anticipation, it became clear that this moment was not the conclusion of anything. It was the beginning of a realization that would extend far beyond a single lecture, far beyond a single equation, because sometimes the most profound lessons are not taught through authority, but revealed through humility. The question lingered in Professor Richard Hale's mind longer than he expected, not a question of mathematics, but of judgment, of assumption, of the quiet certainty he had carried into this room. Without ever realizing it, he stepped forward again, this time slower, more deliberate, his usual confidence replaced by something measured. "Dr. Brooks," he said, his voice steady, but noticeably different from before, "may I ask why you chose not to introduce yourself earlier?" The room shifted slightly. The question was not confrontational, but it carried weight. Because everyone in that hall had participated in the same assumption. Evelyn Brooks did not answer immediately. She glanced briefly at the board, then back at him, her expression calm as ever. "Because it was not necessary," she replied simply. The answer settled into the room with unexpected depth. A few students exchanged glances. One of them leaned back in his chair, as if suddenly aware of how quickly conclusions had been drawn. Dr. Leonard Hayes allowed a faint smile to appear, not amused but understanding, as if he had heard similar answers before from people who did not need to prove anything. Hale nodded slowly, processing her words not as a rebuttal, But as a realization, the lecture hall no longer felt like a stage for performance. It had become something else entirely, a place where perception had been quietly dismantled piece by piece. One of the younger professors seated near the front raised his hand hesitantly. "Dr. Brooks," he began, "would you consider collaborating on a paper regarding this model? Your approach could refine several of the current frameworks." The tone of the room had changed completely. The same voices that had once dismissed her now sought her insight, her contribution, her presence. Evelyn considered the question for a moment, then responded with the same quiet composure. "I would be open to a discussion," she said, "but only if the focus remains on the work, not the recognition." Her words carried a subtle boundary, one that redirected attention away from status and back towards substance. Hale observed this exchange carefully, each sentence, each reaction revealing more than any lecture he had delivered. He stepped aside fully, now no longer occupying the center of the space, but allowing it to shift naturally towards something more balanced. The audience followed suit, their attention no longer guided by hierarchy, but by genuine interest. A student in the back, who had earlier laughed, now sat completely still, his notebook open but untouched, as if he was realizing that the most important lesson of the day had nothing to do with calculus. Another voice spoke from the side, a senior faculty member who had remained silent until now. "Dr. Brooks, your previous work in Boston influenced several of our recent publications. I had not realized you were here." There was a note of humility in his voice, the kind that comes not from obligation, but from recognition. Evelyn inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the statement, without expanding on it. She did not list her accomplishments. She did not correct their earlier assumptions. She simply remained present, allowing the truth to settle on its own terms. Hale looked around the room, taking in the changed expressions, the absence of arrogance, the quiet respect that had replaced it, and for the first time he understood that authority without awareness is fragile, easily undone not by force, but by clarity. He turned back toward Evelyn one final time, his voice quieter than before. "Thank you for your contribution," he said, not as a formality, but as a genuine acknowledgement. Evelyn met his gaze briefly, then nodded once, and in that moment the lecture hall fell into a stillness that felt different from before, not tense, not uncertain, but resolved, because what had unfolded there was no longer just a demonstration of intellect. It was a reminder that the most profound knowledge often arrives without introduction and leaves behind something far more lasting than answers. The room did not return to normal. It could not, because something fundamental had shifted beneath the surface of every person present. Conversations did not resume immediately. Instead, there was a quiet movement, a slow reorganization of thought as students adjusted in their seats and faculty members exchanged measured glances. Professor Richard Hale remained near the front, but no longer commanded attention the way he had before. His presence now felt reflective rather than authoritative, as if he too was still processing what had just unfolded. Evelyn Brooks stepped away from the board, her pace unhurried, her posture unchanged, as she returned toward the back of the lecture hall. But this time the path she walked felt different. Eyes followed her, not with curiosity or judgment, but with recognition. One student instinctively moved his backpack off the adjacent seat, creating space without being asked. Another straightened his posture as she passed, as if acknowledging something he had failed to see earlier. Dr. Leonard Hayes watched her carefully, a thoughtful expression crossing his face before he turned slightly toward the rest of the room. "I believe what we witnessed today goes beyond a technical correction," he said, his voice calm yet deliberate. "It is a demonstration of perspective, of how easily expertise can be overlooked when it does not present itself in expected ways." His words settled, slowly drawing quiet agreement from several faculty members. A senior lecturer nodded subtly, while another scribbled a note, as if capturing a lesson that had nothing to do with equations. Hale listened without interruption, his gaze lowered briefly before lifting again, not to reclaim authority, but to acknowledge what had been said. "You are correct," he admitted quietly, addressing the room. "Rather than any single individual, assumptions can limit understanding more than complexity ever will." The statement was simple, but it carried an unfamiliar humility, one that did not go unnoticed. Evelyn reached her seat and sat down, her notebook still open exactly where she had left it earlier. As if nothing extraordinary had occurred, she picked up her pen and continued writing, her focus returning to the material rather than the moment itself. A student beside her hesitated before speaking, his voice low, almost respectful. "I did not realize you were involved in the Boston workshops," he said carefully. Evelyn glanced at him briefly, then back at her notes. I was part of the team, she replied, her tone neutral, offering no embellishment, no correction to the understatement. The student nodded slowly, absorbing the response, as if understanding that the absence of detail spoke louder than any list of achievements across the room. Quiet conversations began to form, not loud, not disruptive, but thoughtful. Faculty members discussed the implications of her approach, referencing past publications, connecting ideas that now seemed clearer in hindsight. Hale remained at the front, but he did not resume the lecture immediately. Instead, he turned toward the board once more, studying the equation that had once represented his authority, now transformed into something else entirely, a reminder not of failure but of limitation. He picked up the marker and made a small adjustment, incorporating her correction into the framework. The gesture was subtle but significant. It signaled acceptance, not defeat. Dr. Hayes observed this and gave a slight nod of approval. The room gradually settled again, but the energy had changed. It was no longer driven by hierarchy or expectation. It was grounded in something quieter, more genuine, a willingness to reconsider, to listen more closely, to look beyond the surface. And as the lecture prepared to continue, it became clear that while the topic remained calculus, the true subject had shifted entirely, because what they had learned could not be written on the board. It could only be understood in the silence that followed. When certainty gives way to awareness, when the lecture resumed, it did not feel like a continuation. It felt like a recalibration. Professor Richard Hale stood at the front of the room, but his voice carried a different tone, now less performative, more deliberate, as if each word had to pass through a layer of reflection before being spoken. The equations on the board remained the same, but the way they were approached had changed. He paused more often, allowing space for consideration rather than rushing toward conclusion. The students noticed immediately. Some leaned forward, not out of obligation, but genuine engagement, while others followed each step more carefully, as if aware that understanding required more than assumption. In the back row, Evelyn Brooks continued writing quietly. Her presence, once overlooked, now anchored the room in a subtle way, not because she demanded attention, but because everyone knew what she represented, a standard that had revealed itself without effort. A student near the center raised his hand, his voice hesitant but sincere. Professor Hale, could the alternative substitution be applied earlier in the sequence? The question was thoughtful, not challenging, but curious. Hale considered it for a moment, then glanced briefly toward Evelyn. Not seeking approval, but acknowledging possibility. It could, he said slowly, though it would require a shift in how we interpret the initial conditions. The student nodded, taking notes quickly. The exchange was small, but meaningful. The lecture had transformed into a dialogue rather than a performance. Dr. Leonard Hayes observed from his seat, his expression calm, as he watched the dynamic evolve. This was no longer about proving expertise. It was about building understanding together. A faculty member near the aisle leaned toward another, quietly remarking, "This is the most engaged I have seen this room in months." The comment was not critical, it was observational, as if recognizing that something valuable had emerged from an unexpected source. Evelyn paused her writing for a moment, her eyes lifting toward the board, not to correct, not to intervene, but simply to follow the progression. The slight shift in approach was evident, the structure more refined, the logic more transparent. She did not need to say anything. Her earlier contribution had already set the direction. Professor Hale stepped back again, allowing the room to absorb the current step. Before continuing, his gaze moved across the audience, not searching for agreement, but for understanding. It was a subtle but important difference, one that changed the entire atmosphere. A student in the front row, who had remained silent throughout the session, finally spoke, his voice clear. "Dr. Brooks, would you approach this differently if the boundary conditions were altered?" The question caused a slight stir, not because it was inappropriate, but because it addressed Evelyn directly. Hale did not interrupt. He simply turned slightly, giving her the space to respond. Evelyn looked up, meeting the student's gaze for a brief moment before answering. "It depends on what you are optimizing," she said calmly. "If the goal is efficiency, the method may change. If the goal is clarity, the structure remains similar." Her response was concise, but layered, the kind that invited thought rather than closed it. The student nodded slowly, writing down every word. The room fell quiet again, not with tension, but focus, each person aware that they were part of something rare, a moment where knowledge was not dictated but shared. Hale allowed a small pause before continuing, incorporating the question into the next step. Without resistance, without hesitation, the lecture moved forward, but it no longer belonged to a single voice. It belonged to the room. and as the final minutes approached, it became clear that what had begun as a demonstration of authority had transformed into something far more meaningful, a collective understanding shaped not by status, but by substance. And in that quiet shift, the true lesson settled deeper than any equation ever could. The final moments of the lecture did not arrive with a clear ending. They settled gradually, like the quiet lowering of lights after a performance that no one had expected to witness. Professor Richard Hale stood at the front once more, but the distance between him and the audience no longer felt like hierarchy. It felt like reflection. The board behind him still carried the equation, now refined, no longer a symbol of authority, but a record of transformation. He looked out across the room, his gaze moving from student to student, then briefly toward Evelyn Brooks, seated calmly in the back, her pen resting lightly against her notebook. As if the moment had already passed for her while it was still unfolding for everyone else, Hale drew a slow breath, as if choosing his final words carefully. Today's discussion, he began, has taken a direction I did not anticipate, but perhaps one that was necessary. His voice carried evenly, not projecting dominance, but acknowledging reality. Mathematics, he continued, is not only about precision, it is about perspective, and perspective is shaped not just by what we know, but by how willing we are to recognize what we do not. The room remained still, every word landing with quiet clarity. A student near the aisle nodded slowly. Another closed his notebook, not because he was finished, but because he understood that the most important lesson could not be written down. Dr. Leonard Hayes leaned back slightly, his expression composed, yet satisfied, as if the outcome had confirmed something he had always known, but rarely seen so clearly. Hale stepped away from the podium, no dramatic gesture, no attempt to reclaim the moment, just a simple movement that signaled completion. The lecture is concluded, he said softly, but no one moved. Immediately, the silence that followed was not hesitation, it was acknowledgement, the kind that does not require applause because it has already been felt. Evelyn closed her notebook, then rose quietly, gathering her things without urgency. As she stepped into the aisle, several students instinctively shifted to make space for her, their movements subtle but intentional, a quiet respect that had not been present before. She walked toward the exit, her pace steady, her presence unchanged, as if nothing about her had needed to adapt for this moment because it had always been there, unnoticed until now. As she reached the doorway, she paused for the briefest second, not turning back, not seeking recognition, just allowing the stillness to settle completely before stepping out into the corridor beyond. Inside the lecture hall, Professor Hale remained standing for a moment longer, his eyes resting on the board before lowering slightly, a faint nod barely visible, but real. The room slowly began to stir, conversations forming, not loud or excited, but thoughtful, reflective voices carrying a different tone than when the day had begun, because something had shifted, not in the equations, but in the people who had come to learn them. And as the lights above continued to glow against the polished floor, a quiet understanding remained long after the lecture had ended, that true knowledge does not announce itself, it reveals itself in moments when certainty is challenged and dignity is quietly restored. Respect often reveals itself when you least expect it. If you enjoy stories that uncover truth, dignity, and hidden strength, do not forget to like and subscribe. The next story might just change the way you see the world. Thank you so much for watching.